So the problem that we're going to be talking about is a complex problem, too complex for a bumper sticker, and the knowledge required to deal with it is similarly complex, though the answer is not necessarily that complex. So this is what's showing here is the declaration that Occupy put out. It's its key document that explains what it does. And what it does is it tracks or parallels the Declaration of Independence. And to the Occupy movement, it has that same importance. And what I've done is extracted a few of the key points that I thought would relate to what we're talking about this morning, and I'll come back to later. And I should first say that I'm not speaking for, but with Occupy. So I've been invited to come talk about this subject, but at this point, to speak for Occupy requires a whole democratic process, and this is a teach-in to convey information. But like many, I've observed that Occupy wants more democracy than we have and less social inequality. That they've been protesting a government that's put control of our country into the hands of 1% who run it for their own interests while running roughshod over the public interest. With their greedy hands on the wheel, we've run into a series of crises. We're facing crises today, and there are more to come in fields like health and food and civil liberties and climate. And if we don't get their hands off the wheel, the possibility is that we're going to crash into these crises, one or another of them, and I haven't named them all. So for the average American today, there's less stability and certainty with the status quo than there is by changing the status quo. And that's an unusual situation. That's a situation for change, and that's the situation that Occupy enters, is saying that they have a way of dealing with it. So, and one of the ways that they've decided to deal with it is to rely on the Constitution of the United States. So their strategy, and I'm going to read this for people who don't consult the Constitution frequently, is they're using the First Amendment right to freedom of speech and the right of the people peaceably to assemble. And I think they're preparing to use the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. And that will be happening in due course once meetings like this are held and decisions are made about what we should petition for specifically, what strategies we think are the best strategies, and then the petition will come. So I have an idea that I'll be talking about in this talk about what a petition that was effective would look like. And so I'd be proposing that what we do is we attach to the petition pledges of people who are willing to vote against any incumbents who would refuse to accept and adopt the petition, to endorse the petition, and if it's a law, make it into law. So that's what I think, what I would propose is a very effective petition. But we'll see. I think we can depend on this movement, Occupy, to be as creative with the petition process as they have been with the peaceably to assemble process that they've been using very effectively. And in my mind, maybe one of the most effective movements in American history in such a short time that they've been able to change the conversation from essentially a lie that no economist would accept, that more inequality will create growth, when, as I'll be showing later, particularly if we get these slides up, some graphs that show just the opposite is true, and that every credible economist thinks just the opposite, that it's inequality that causes lack of growth. So they've also taught us by putting their own necks on the line, by standing on the Constitution and the rights in the Constitution. They've shown us a government willing to use police state tactics. I mean, when we heard the news this year about evicting the Occupy protesters, it was hard to tell what was coming from the Middle East and what was coming from the United States, because our government showed that they have no compunction using the very same police state tactics. And now, I'm sure many here know, that they're bringing our, our troops home from wars that have been fought on behalf of, excuse me, on behalf of corrupt dictatorship. I have some experience in Afghanistan, so I sort of know of what I speak here, of a corrupt narco state on the one hand, and a corrupt petro state on the other hand, which they fought under false pretenses and sent our Americans over to die for, with knowledge that they couldn't accomplish anything on behalf of a corrupt government. You can't win a counterinsurgency on behalf of a corrupt government. So these troops are now coming home from those imperial wars and being asked to get retrained in population control under the name of counterinsurgency training, to use what they learned abroad here at home. And these are the same soldiers who have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. Their oath is not to uphold a government. Their oath is to the Constitution. And so I see what Occupy has done as standing firmly on the Constitution. And everything I've seen from Occupy seems consistent with this, as being extremely important and putting them in solidarity with other people who have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution in this clash, this seeming clash that we've encountered between a government that polls show can only scare up about 17% of the people who think that this government has the consent of the governed. The Rasmussen poll organization polls on that subject frequently, and it's shown a declining percentage that are fairly consistent, but the latest one is 17%. Now that's about half of the number of people that felt that George III had the consent of the governed during the Revolutionary War and gave rise to the Declaration of Independence, because historians say that the Loyalist faction during the Revolution was about a third of the population. You know, they felt that George III was legitimate. It was the other two-thirds that didn't. So we're in a situation where we have a government that is less legitimate to its people than George III was during the Revolution. Of course, this government is also far more powerful and has potential of doing far more damage than George III did. And so, and also the damage that can be done if we fail to do what the revolutionary generation did, we all know is far greater. And so this is the first point that I've extracted, and I'll quote this from the Declaration of Occupation, which anyone can find on the New York City General Assembly website. And also, Tim, these will be online, right, these slides, so we'll put these up online. So anybody who wants to pursue this, you don't have to take notes or anything. This will all be online with a lot more material as well. So the Declaration reads that the future of the human race requires the cooperation of its members. That's the starting point, is that this is what's at stake here today, what we're talking about, and the continuation of the Occupy movement. They say that our system must protect our rights, and upon corruption of that system, it is up to the individuals to protect their own rights and those of their neighbors. So it's a call to, we all need to take action. This is serious. And then the statement that I've quoted here is, no true democracy is attainable when the process is determined by economic power. And then the other quote I've taken out is out of 23. Again, the first part tracks the Declaration of Independence, the provision that talks about the we hold these truths to be self-evident. And so what I just read were three principles that are extracted from that part of the Occupation Declaration that parallels the Declaration of Independence. Then they state, again, paralleling the Declaration of Independence, the facts to a candid world part of the Declaration of Independence. And I've just extracted the one that's relevant to our discussion, which is they have donated large sums of money to politicians who are responsible for regulating them. what kind of captures what we're here to talk about is that we have a government that's sold out to the 1% and don't serve us. And so then the Declaration does, again, tracking the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence addresses the world, explaining why the United States should be independent of Britain. And here what the occupied declarers do is actually ask the world to join them. And so they urge the world, and I think this is significant because I spend a lot of my time outside the country actually, and I know that it's a common understanding by people around the world that whatever we do here about this situation we've got of the corruption of democracy right out from under us in the last few decades, that's going to influence the whole world. In other words, just like the founders came up with a template to resist tyranny, and then secondly, American history for 200 years extended the benefits of freedom from tyranny from the original 10% who wrote the Constitution and were the enfranchised people at that time, about 10–12% historians say, were the property owners, no one else could vote. And then American history, our history is about extending that to falsely to former slaves with the 15th Amendment, but then eventually with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 actually enfranchising the descendants of former slaves, women by the 19th Amendment, and most recently by the amendment that gave 18-year-olds the vote. We extended it to younger people. And we haven't completed the process yet. We still have a doctrine called felon disenfranchisement, and we still have territories, this sort of quaint heritage from an imperial, 19th century imperialism, where we have territories around the world that aren't fully enfranchised. So we haven't fully completed this process of extending the freedom from tyranny to, from the 10%, but we've probably extended it to about 90–95%. We've gotten that far, which is pretty good. And then just at the point that we did that, which was that last amendment to be proposed and ratified in 1971, the one that enfranchised the 18-year-olds, it was that year that Justice Powell was asked by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to write a memorandum of how the rich could get the country back after they'd experienced this. Basically, by 1976, the top 1% had lost their share of the national wealth over a long period of time of about 30 years. And they had hit the point in 1976 of having just 8.9% of the national wealth. Now, of course, in the next 30 years, after 76, next 35 years, but I have data here for the 30-year period, they now have it's approaching 25% of the national wealth. So there are two periods of history here, and it reversed and centers on the year 1976. So, what we're doing here today is, as the slide shows, we're exercising our right to peaceably assemble, as the Occupy New York and this key document from the Occupy movement urges us to do. And we're occupying public space here, which the library graciously makes available to us. And Occupy Northfield, and consistently with the Occupy movement, has created a process to address the problems we face, which includes the meetings that are held by the General Assembly of Occupy Northfield, and includes this teach-in, another teach-in, and other actions to come. And then what we hope to do here today is to take the first step towards generating solutions accessible to everyone. So that's the task before us. That's what I hope we can accomplish. Now, this is my own opinion, but I take that the strategy of Occupy to take over public, get into public spaces, what we're doing, and to talk to each other, is an implicit criticism of a propagandistic media which does not provide a safe space for democratic conversation in our country. In fact, quite the contrary. What they do is they use propagandist techniques like ad hominem attack and the big lie, which is the opposite of democratic conversation. So that's how I take this very important tactic or strategy of Occupy, is implicit criticism. So in return, I think the media knows that, and the media is an enemy of the Occupy movement. They want to continue mediating democratic conversation in the country, and Occupy provides a way to bypass them. And so the criticism here is, if you can see that they have no demands, but actually, I like this cartoon because front and center, I don't know if you can read, is get money out of politics. But before I go on to talk about that issue of getting money out of politics, I want to show another document that is what I consider maybe the second most important document from the Occupy movement, again posted on the website that the New York group has put up, the OWS group has put up. And here they describe, in very polite terms, their relationship with what they call, at the end of the document, and then they give some operative language which appears here, about professional activists. And they come up with a rule. Now, professional activists are the ones that you can tell from their statement are people who get money to do politics in America. I've worked out of Washington, D.C., and I've worked with Ralph Nader, for example, and I consider Nader the person who established this, and I consider him a noble, great citizen, basically. But a lot of people were inspired by that and went to Washington and really made a business out of doing politics, and it hasn't succeeded. And so the Occupy movement is not making a business out of politics. They are not asking for money. They receive money, but they don't ask for money. But here they have an operative rule that says if you are representing or being compensated by an independent source while participating in our process, please disclose your affiliation at the outset. So I think this is such a great idea, and in fact their analysis is so fundamentally right, that I want to at least respond to this. So I'm not representing here any organization not receiving compensation. This is something I'm doing because I think it's important. And the other people here, I know, for example, Bill provided all this, the hot beverages in the back. I never heard him mention a word about any money. And Bob produced a very nice poster. I never heard a word about any money. And this is what citizens do. And so I have a principle of my own that if you hear a strategy, and that person is first thing you hear, and you'll see this. There's an organization right now called Move to Amend, that the first thing you'll see on the second line will be, give us money. We want to do a demonstration at the Supreme Court. Send us money. And it's like, you can almost be certain that if they're asking for money, this is my own view, I mean, you can decide for yourself, they're probably not going to be making any significant change. They're probably more part of the system than they're going to be capable of saving the system. I should say that last one too, that what Occupy has done, I think it shows really considerable political maturity to understand that. Because I've worked with grassroots organizations where I was as a lawyer representing them, and they come to Washington with a lot of energy and a lot of power, and all of a sudden these professional activists descend on them because they see a fundraising opportunity. And a lot of people don't get it. They go, oh, these are our friends, aren't they? And nope, they're not your friends. So I think it's I think it just shows a lot of that the Occupy people are not naive, that they show a lot of political maturity in making that their second document. First one is against the 1%. Second one is against this professional class of politicians. And Occupy thereby defines themselves as a movement. They define themselves as a leaderless movement that will establish a space where democratic conversation can take place. They've established processes that will do that, and it's just up for us to use them. So the other document from the Occupy movement that I wanted to refer to as what I thought a nice introduction to what I want to talk about is one that I actually don't know anything about this document. It's not on an official website, but it's a document that calls for a National General Assembly for April 1, which I don't think is an April Fool's joke, but who knows. But it refers to, I think, the key issues. In fact, I think it leaves nothing out, since they say they want to focus on these 3 points, which is, I'll read the quote, "The failure of the Democrats and Republicans in Congress to represent the views of the majority of the people." I think that pretty much lays it out, that we don't have a democracy anymore, and both parties are complicit in it. And if we fool ourselves into thinking, oh, you know, this party or that party, we're missing the point. They're both in on it. They both have facilitated it. They both profit it. It's the business plan that they have. I mean, basically those parties are bank accounts and they raise money. That's their business plan. Then the second point is equally as good. It says the Supreme Court, they're going to focus on the Supreme Court for allowing the Constitution to be perverted and for ignoring the rule of law, which again gets the point. Unlike people who are running around the country right now saying, oh, we have to amend the Constitution, and there's a lot of this happening. It's amazing how current this trope has become of, you know, and then there's Larry Lessig at Harvard who wants to actually just trash the Constitution. Let's have a constitutional convention. Just give up the one we have. Well, I'll be talking later, if we don't run out of time with my slow presentation here, about why that's totally unnecessary. We don't need it. And it's wrong. Is that it's the Constitution is where we stand. You know, that's what we're doing here today. We're standing firmly within the Constitution. That's what Occupy has been doing. Firmly, totally within the Constitution against an illegitimate government that operates totally outside the Constitution. And that's what's going on here. So to go around and say, oh, let's just give up on the Constitution is the wrong thing. That's not what we're doing. And so then the third point, they point the finger correctly at the Chamber of Commerce, which actually did hire, as I was saying earlier, Justice Powell to write the memorandum that really laid out the whole strategy of how the rich could take the country back. And that has been executed, and he helped do it when he was a justice on the Supreme Court. And then they point to the lobbyists on K Street that carry out the same strategy and dominate the political process in favor of the 1% at the expense of the 99%. So any discussion of money in politics has to begin with these guys. So since taking over the Supreme Court in 2006, the Roberts 5 has issued 5 decisions on the issue of money in politics. And what those 5 decisions do is, the first one struck down Vermont state legislation restricting campaign contributions within the framework that had been set down in 1976 in Buckley v. Vallejo, but they did the best they could within that framework. And the court struck that down. States are just as corrupted by the Supreme Court as is the federal government. There's no difference. They're using the First Amendment, applies to everybody, so there's no exemptions for state governments. States are just as free to be corrupted by big money. The other one was, there was a millionaire amendment that made it more difficult for millionaires to buy elections, people like Mayor Bloomberg in New York, for example. And the court struck that down as well. And then there was a law that tried to define issues, distinguish issues, issue campaigns that would mention a candidate. And so they're actually electioneering, but under the guise of issues. And the Supreme Court just opened up a big hole through that law that allowed corporations to mention candidates and so forth, as long as they didn't use a few magic words like vote for. But that opened a huge gap for corporate money to come into politics. And then, of course, the one you've heard about, because it's more easy to describe and a kind of, actually, I think, demagogue a little bit, is Citizens United. And that allowed for, I just have to say, my neighbor Jack Thurnbat is here. Hey, Jack. Good to see you. That they said that independent expenditures, those that are not given directly to candidates, corporations can spend as much as they want. So sort of like the issue ads, but now they can do a little more. They can actually attack the candidate or support a candidate. So it's a little better than what they already had. You know, it's a little better. Some more money came into politics, but it was already corrupt. And then this year, the Arizona legislation, which was the best solution available under the circumstances, which was public funding of a kind that allowed the publicly funded candidate to match with public funds the privately funded candidate. And so that you'd have an even playing field between the publicly funded and the privately funded. That's the only way public funding can work, in my view, because otherwise, if you just say, well, you can get, you know, 30,000 or something, or Arizona was something like 21,000 to run for office, then the other side knows exactly how much they have to spend. In California, which is sort of the purest case because they have term limits, the data shows that if you spend 3 times as much as your opponent, you're 98% certain of getting elected. In Congress, the ratio is about 2 to 1 on average, that the average winner spends twice as much as the average loser. And so if you just have a fixed amount of money, and not one that will increase as the other side spends more money, then you'll just always lose, and the public will be just wasting its money, basically, because they'll always lose. They'll spend it but lose. So the Supreme Court decided, for reasons best known to themselves, that that was unconstitutional, even though, as the dissent pointed out, that that meant for more robust debate, which is one of the main objectives of the First Amendment, and it meant for actually more speech as well. The more they spend, the more speech you'll have. But the Supreme Court said, nope, because that was the only remedy left to us as citizens to try to even just match the money of the 1%. Didn't work. So the Roberts Court, these guys, represent a complete triumph of plutocracy over democracy. Particularly with that case this year, the Arizona case, they indicate that anything we try to do to remedy the situation in a sort of incremental way, that if it is effective, they're going to strike it down. So I think it means that people who have been hoping for some other way to deal with this problem than dealing with the court itself have to go back to the drawing boards, and no one's actually come up with a good solution to this. So the solutions that are available first of all, I want to go back to this 1976 case, Buckley v. Vallejo, and talk about that, because all the other cases are built on that. And in 1976, the court held that money equals speech. Now, when you think of that, none of us has ever seen money talk, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense on its own. But then again, we know that if you have money, you can broadcast your views better, you can buy a TV station, or you can do whatever you want, you know, with money. You can get your word out. So it has some connection to speech. But in 1976, when that decision was made, is when we see, if we look at this graph, there's a lot of information in this graph, if you can see it. I really want to look at this closely, because it really, for a little graph, is one of my favorite ones. Is if you look at the blue all the way to the left, in the period 1946 to 76, you see that the nation grew. I don't know if can people see it? Can anyone in the back actually read the? Okay, good. So the blue shows that in those 30 years, we were growing at a faster rate than in the 30 years between 76 and 2007. So our growth has decreased at the same time that our inequality has increased. And you can see how the inequality has increased. That the yellow bar in 1946 shows the growth of income of the bottom 90%. And then over in the 1976 to 2007 period, you can see the growth. Not very much. It pretty much almost disappears. And then you see in the red bar that the growth of the top 1% was pretty moderate in the period 46 to 76. And then after 76, it just leaps. Just leaps. And it's the money in that red bar that's buying our politics. So I want to make this point even firmer, because you have this whole propaganda campaign that I mentioned earlier to say just the opposite, that it's actually more inequality will create growth. And so here is a quote, the findings from an IMF study this year, that fairly, so what do you call this, econology, but it's economic language, but it says we find that longer growth spells are robustly associated with more equality in the income distribution, by which they mean that you get sustainable growth from equality, and you get bubbles, spurts of growth from bubbles where you have inequality, and that's where we are. And we have pretty much one bubble after the other. So now I want to get into some polling data. And how many people agree that we have such a system that favors and serves just a very small proportion of the rich. I'll read the whole, this is a question, it's a long question, so it's kind of worth reading this. So, the current economic structure of the country is out of balance and favors a very small proportion of the rich over the rest of the country. America needs to reduce the power of major banks and corporations and demand greater accountability and transparency. The government should not provide financial aid to corporations and should not provide tax breaks to the rich. So 60% strongly agree, 16% mildly agree, 76%. That should be enough pretty much to pass a policy, wouldn't you think? Well, not in this country, because we don't have a democracy. And those statistics stay pretty firm through a lot of different polling. Then this is one of my favorite ones, the CNN poll this year, which again is substantiated by a lot of other polling. I try to, you can lie with statistics and so forth, so just any poll you grab out. But these are statistics that hold up through a lot of different ways of asking the question. And so it's elected officials in Washington are mostly influenced by A, what is in the best interest of the country? No, don't think so. The pressure they receive on issues from major campaign contributors. 86% of the people. It's no secret. People, pretty much everybody knows. And then when you get to this last poll and this gets to the issue of the Supreme Court's, but money is speech. When corporations give money, this is speech. They're talking about policy issues and so forth. This enhances our conversation here. Well, American people don't buy that. What they say is that corporations spend money on politics to buy influence or elect people favorable to their financial interests. That sounds like corruption to me. Does that sound like corruption to you? And that's so, what the pollster says about this, it's universal. When they get to 95%, it's like, who's left? It's a universal. Everybody in the country knows that this is why corporations spend money on politics. So this is not speech any more than fraud, which is done with speech, is speech, or that, let's say, pornography is speech, or let's say, if no one minds me saying it, pimping is speech. In other words, there are a lot of verbal crimes that take place where it's simply a crime. It's a crime. It does harm. There's no content here in what's going on. And so the fact is that all Americans, other than, I think I go back to those 5 guys again, if we move on. I guess not. But anyway, other than those 5 guys, we'll get back to those guys. But other than them, it's like everybody knows that this isn't speech that corporations are doing. They've bought our government. That's what they're doing with their money. So that hurts this First Amendment argument that the court makes. Now this one shows, and this is one where I think I might be bringing some new information, is I searched around for the return on investment that this money gets. And a group of academics in Kansas did a study, and they picked a very good law to do the study on. It's the same thing that's being talked about right now, which is repatriation of earnings abroad. So like as a person, I've worked abroad and I get taxed by the US government. I have to pay my taxes. I don't have to pay my taxes when I bring my money back to that. I have to pay my taxes when earned. But corporations get a special break. They get to not pay their taxes for their earnings overseas until they bring them back into the country when they need them back here. And so in 2004 and again this year, Congress is going to, for pay, exempt them from that tax. I mean, that's money that belongs in the Treasury. If they want to bring it back, they bring it back. And so in 2004, they exempted them. So that's a situation where there are no contingencies involved. It's straight money for money. You put some money in the pocket of a politician, they'll vote for a law that exempts you from this much taxes. That's a good deal. So what is the rate of return? What's the cut the politicians get out of that? And what they showed is it's a 22,000% return on your investment. $220 saved or spent by the US government in return for $1 in the pocket of a politician. So, and that figure, now that's a rigorous academic study, okay? So I like to quote that one. But I myself have done a rule of thumb on what do defense contractors spend and what are their profits, 400 times on that one. Just sort of very simple, back of the envelope. And other people have done these calculations on different issues, and it goes up to upward of 1,000 times. $1,000 back for $1 in lobbying and campaign contributions. So that's the return on investment they get. Kind of belies the idea that this is speech and something other than something that's being done for their own financial interests. And if anybody would like to pursue, Tim told me I shouldn't put this up, but it's too much text. But anyway, I just wanted to show there are a few books that really do a good job at taking this whole process of showing how money buys public policy, starting in the 70s. Most of these books pin it down. This started in the 70s. That public policy in return generates vast income for the people who buy it. They get extraordinarily rich while the rest of us get poorer because they're taking it from public funds and public goods of different kinds, whether it's the environment or what it may be. That the inequality causes lack of growth, a stagnant economy, which means a stagnant economy doesn't have enough employment for everybody who needs it, because the money that goes out of the pockets of the majority, like we saw in that previous bar graph, doesn't get spent. When it's in the pockets of average people, it pretty much gets spent. And so that creates demand. But what happens with the money now, and that's where we're living in that world today, is it goes into speculation, and you get asset bubbles and different bubbles as they speculate on different, now it's commodities or it's gold and oil and so forth today. But these are all just bubbles. This is where the money goes. That doesn't create any growth, or very, very little at best. So These are the books that paint out that whole thing. So what can we do for this guy, who I think would represent all of us? Is there anything practical that we can do about it? So again, so it comes back to these guys. What they've done is they've overstepped the bounds of the proper scope of their own authority. Back from the beginning of the country, down to 1976, in that Buckley v. Vallejo case, there was a rule that divided the legislative power from the judicial power. It was called the political question doctrine. It was first described by the most famous Chief Justice Marshall in the most famous case, Marbury versus Madison, where the court first said that they have authority to review the constitutionality of statutes, which has been used by the court to strike down all these campaign finance reforms. In the same decision, they said that, however, there are certain class of cases that involve political questions. And of course, we wouldn't step into that. That's not our role. And they defined those political questions. One was where that particular function was already given to one of the other branches of government, like elections, for example. Under Article 1, Sections 4 and 5, Congress is given the authority to regulate and judge elections, which is one of the very few times the word judge is used for anything other than judiciary, which indicates an indication that elections are really for Congress to deal with, not for the courts. Beyond that, elections specifically have been held to be the quintessential political questions. Marshall described it as things that concern everybody as a whole, not just particular individuals, and that obviously is elections. Everybody gets to vote. The type of elections we have affects everyone. And so over the years, down to 1976, the court had stayed out of dealing with election issues, except in one case where they properly did deal with it, and that was where the legislatures had entrenched themselves by refusing to reapportion their districts. So they were all out of whack, and it violated the equal protection argument of one person, one vote. So that was the one exception where the court had said, look, if we don't do something about it, this entrenched power of minority that have taken over legislatures, these rural minorities, will never give up their power, so we have to step in and do it. So that was appropriate. That was where one of the branches of government was defying the Constitution, the idea of democracy, and the court stepped in. But with that one exception, the courts had entirely stayed out of elections until 1976. And that's when the country started going downhill, as soon as they stepped in. So, can Congress simply enact a piece of legislation that would restore that doctrine? It would seem so. That the court themselves imposed the doctrine on themselves for all those years down to 1976, and then the court decided to trash the doctrine. It would seem that it was a good doctrine. Many courts, many judges said it was an essential doctrine that defined the role of the judiciary, and it would seem that Congress could go back and could take care of it. But there's even stronger authority. And this is it. And I put this up here. It's, I think, other than the First Amendment, that this is the only law. And because I wanted to ask, I want you to actually read this and see this, because this is almost a secret. It's Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2, Sentence 2 of the Constitution. It's called the Exceptions Clause. And I'm just wondering, I'll explain one thing that may be obvious to people, but I'll just explain it, that what the meaning of appellate jurisdiction is what it sounds like. It's when the court takes an appeal from another court. And that is virtually everything the Supreme Court does, including every case involving elections. So that may need some explanation, but does anyone need a lawyer here to interpret what this means? Can I get a job? Am I right that this pretty much explains itself? No? A little more complicated than that? Okay, all right. The hypothesis wasn't borne out. Okay, so the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. In other words, the Supreme Court shall have authority to hear cases with such exceptions and under such regulations that Congress makes. In other words, Congress gets to tell the court what cases they can hear. Okay? That's how it works in a democracy. The court does, an unelected court doesn't get to tell Congress what cases they can hear. Where do they stop then? Where do these politicians in robes stop telling us what to do? It doesn't work that way in a democracy. It has to be, ultimately it's a question whether you have this, and this comes under a phrase of judicial supremacy, which I call the judicial supremacy ideology, is what it is. Because there's no basis for it anywhere in law. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court gets the last word for declaring, for example, election laws unconstitutional. Nowhere. Doesn't say it there. But it does say that Congress can strip their jurisdiction if they want to. If the court gets, and it doesn't say if the court gets out of hand, but I would add that because this power has been used very sensitively by Congress, mainly because the Supreme Court, no matter how bad they are, tends to be more popular than Congress. And so it's very hard for Congress to get up enough political capital to take on the Supreme Court. And so it seldom happens unless the people themselves demand it. So this power has been used by Congress on several occasions. The most important of them was perhaps after the Civil War, when Congress established military rule over the South, and a case challenging that was going up, ex parte Mercardal was going up through the courts and reached the Supreme Court, and suddenly Congress felt that, ooh, they might declare this unconstitutional, so we're just going to strip their jurisdiction to hear the case. They already had it. And the court said, oh, I guess we don't have jurisdiction, dismissed. So the court understands this power. They've never defied it when Congress has used it from time to time. There are many times they've referred to it as a premise for something else. But in any event, Congress has used it. The Supreme Court understands it. Some law professors know about it. But because of what I like to call this judicial supremacy ideology, it's sort of lawyers, and you can try this out at home if you know any lawyers. You can ask them about this, and they'll go, oh, no, we don't want Congress to use that power. That's a slippery slope if they do it. If they do it to save democracy, who knows what they'll do it for next, you know? And I'm serious, it's very funny, but you actually get that response from most lawyers, because they learn in law school that this ideology, that, ooh, the Supreme Court's supreme. And you can kind of figure this out why. Because their professors think of themselves as having some power by writing articles that influences the court. They're sort of the courtiers at the foot of power. So the more powerful the court is, the more powerful they are, and the more powerful lawyers are who take cases and so forth. So you can understand it's in their self-interest. But I almost feel, and it's interesting, one of the exceptions, there's a lawyer in Vermont who is working on this against Vermont efforts to try to get Vermont to take some action to ask Congress to exercise this power, to strip the court of jurisdiction. And he doesn't have this problem because he didn't go to law school. Vermont has this means to become a lawyer. You just read in the law office and take the bar exam. So now I'm going to talk about, well, first let me ask, we're here to talk about strategies to get money out of politics, and I'm wondering if anybody, so I just don't command the floor here, have a little interactivity. Does anyone have any ideas of things that they've heard to get money out of politics? Anyone want to offer a suggestion? No? No? Gone. Okay. So I'll offer one. The one that you've probably heard of is corporate personhood. Right? Pretty much everybody's heard about that? It's been one of the most amazing frauds, actually, as a political issue that I've ever experienced. Now, I can explain why, but let me just go through so you have your own inoculation against it, if it ever comes up. First of all, this idea was around for a while. I mean, I knew some of the people who were advocating this. It was a rather minor issue. They were talking about corporate charter revocation as a way of doing sort of capital punishment in really bad corporations. It was a good idea. And then they complained about the fact that the Supreme Court had recognized that corporations have some constitutional rights like Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment. And that's arguable. I won't get too much into detail because we do have limited time. But when it really got to be popular, and I think you can bear me out on this, you started hearing about this within the last 2 years. You heard a lot about corporate person. Before, you didn't hear much about it. Basically what happened was Tom Hartman had written a book about this subject. I read the book. It was really good. And he talked about corporations in American history, how the revolutionary generation really hated them because they were really rebelling against the East India Company, not Britain. And so, you know, corporations had a bad reputation. So it was interesting. And then he went on to deal with these cases where the Supreme Court had ruled that there are certain rights against the states that corporations would have. And then when Citizens United was decided, Tom thought, ooh, I should get out a second edition of my book. This sounds really important. This is a corporate case. And he decided, well, they must have ruled that corporations have personhood. And that's why they gave corporations the right to corrupt our campaigns. But that wasn't it. That isn't what they did. Actually, what they did is they read the First Amendment. And if you see that, there's no mention of person in the First Amendment. Citizens United was a First Amendment case. Just as Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. What the court did was say that freedom of speech is an abstraction, and it's about communications and receiving communications. And so we're going to protect the right of the voters to get those communications from any source, whatever the source. I mean, I think it could be a artificially intelligent robot, and they'd still say, oh, it's protected. You know, just the point was not corporations. And so just so you know, again, here's a very long one. Don't necessarily have to read it, but I'll read it. This is what the ruling in the court actually was. You can say you've seen it. You know, you've actually looked at the language. You don't have to go to the law library. And it says, voters must be free to obtain information from diverse sources in order to determine how to cast their votes. That's what they were protecting, was the right of voters, not corporations. And I want to be sure, as I say this, I'm not defending their case in any way, because we'll get to that. But this is what they said. You have to start with what they said. And then they ruled that the final paragraph of this section of the case, where they give their ruling, and this is the ruling: when government seeks to use its full power, including the criminal law, to command where a person may get his or her information, or what distrusted source he or she may not hear, it uses censorship to control thought. This is unlawful. The First Amendment confirms the freedom to think for ourselves. So that's the ruling. Nothing about corporate person. Citizens United didn't mention the term corporate personhood. They didn't mention the concept. You know, that it doesn't rely on it. None of their cases rely on corporate personhood. Mainly because corporate personhood is a 14th Amendment concept. Person is mentioned in the 14th Amendment. That's a different set of rights. The First Amendment doesn't rely on persons. But people have been using this anyway. They're saying, and you can find numerous places online, groups that are out raising money, professional activists, who will actually say, and some of them are lawyers. I mean, I have a collection of these statements, that the Supreme Court and Citizens United declared that corporations are persons, and they therefore have the right to spend money in campaigns. It's simply not true. So what I've done is I've given a summary here of the problems with the corporate personhood amendment idea. You know, first, it's a lie, basically. I call it a lie, it's strong language, but it's lawyers who are doing this. They can read a case, you know. They can go back and see what it actually said before they go public and give people advice about what the case said. And they didn't say anything about corporate personhood. And then all corporations are the wrong political target. You only have probably less than 0.01% of corporations who do invest in politics. The rest are people here on Main Street. I mean, there are 6 million corporations in the country. There are only 2,000 that have PACs. So I figure you could triple that number and get a pretty good estimate of what the number of corporations who actually do get involved in making money off politics. So, and then And then it's the wrong criticism. To attack the court for saying that somebody has a right or not isn't really the problem with Citizens United. The problem is what we already talked about, is that it's corruption. It's not speech. Whoever has the right. It doesn't make corporations, a partnership, a sole proprietorship, or an individual. It doesn't really matter. It's corruption. They're buying policy for profit. That's not speech. That's the better attack. The other thing is that the court, by distracting attention over on this issue of the First Amendment, and who has, who doesn't, why, and so forth, they really distracted people from looking at their actual decision. Was that, look, the damage of money in politics is vast. I've just described here the details of it. We've lost it as a country. We have to fight to get it back because of money in politics. That's the damage done. So focusing on corporate personhood ignores that. But the problem here is that when you apply the First Amendment, it's always a balancing test. You can do this at home. It's safe. You can actually take, okay, what's the amount of actual speech going on here? In the case of corporations, corrupting government, basically none, essentially. A token amount maybe, symbolic, but it's basically pure corruption. On the other hand, what's the damage done? Vast. So this case is a slam dunk case. I mean, the corporation should not have the right to corrupt our politics. A way to compare this would be the Occupy movement. Very same issue. You can do this at home too. Take on the one hand the Occupy encampment. Is that speech? I'd say absolutely yes. It's the encampment tactic that got the message out to the American people more than, as I say, my own. I mean, I think more than, I can't look back in American history that there's been such an effective communication to change a whole conversation. Yeah, that was speech. It symbolizes their commitment. It symbolizes their dispossession. It symbolizes their gathering to talk this out until it's solved. So it symbolizes a lot of different elements of the core part of their communication. And they stand squarely on the First Amendment. Nothing outside, totally nonviolent, peaceably to assemble. So it's pure, all the way around, First Amendment activity. And then if you look at, well, what's the damage done? You have to balance this, right? Well, you know, Mayor Bloomberg said, well, they got to obey the rules. Well, wait a minute, though. Mayor Bloomberg didn't have to obey the rules. He didn't have to obey that law about millionaires. You know, the Supreme Court knocked that down for him under the First Amendment. Right? So obeying the rules doesn't quite make it. You know, it has to be something real. And I would say that there wasn't anything. So I'm hoping as one of the strategies of Occupy that they sue these cities and get huge damages, and they might. I hope they do. I know National Lawyers Guild is working on it. So another reason why corporate personhood is a bad idea is it sort of alienates. I kind of suggested this is a minor issue, but it's worth saying. 7 minutes. That it alienates people who really like the First Amendment because it's aiming at the wrong side of the equation. You aim at the other side of the damage done, not the right. And then it's ineffective, as I said, about partnership, proprietorships, individuals can just get around it. Pass a constitutional amendment abolishing corporate personhood and you will accomplish nothing, actually, even if you win. Now, of course, you won't win because constitutional amendment is impossible. There were no constitutional amendments during the first Gilded Age, from 1870 to 1912, and we're back in the second Gilded Age now, and there's been no constitutional amendment both proposed and ratified since 1971, and there won't be one. Why? Because of that. You can't get something good through Congress, and we won't go back to those five guys, you remember them. They'll pass any constitutional amendment that plutocracy wants. They don't need a constitutional amendment, and they can block any that we want. When I ask people, well, what states would be, name a few states that would actually support a constitutional amendment to rein in corporate power? Well, it wouldn't be, and it has to be the legislature, remember. Well, it wouldn't be Minnesota, wouldn't be Wisconsin. Let's see, and I always get the same answer. Vermont? And Vermont, it's like, that's it. You're not going to get 38 states, which are required for constitutional amendment. So I'm going to, in 5 minutes, and I thought it would happen this way, so it's not unexpected, I want to just introduce one strategy, because you should be left with this analysis. Okay, well, constitutional amendment is a bad idea. This corporate personhood stuff is nonsense. It's basically a fraud. But we've been shown what we could do. We could use the authority that Congress has to strip the court of jurisdiction. Then it's open to us to write any law we want about money in politics. So what I would advocate, what we do advocate, is a comprehensive law that plugs every hole. Use some of the old laws, which should now be valid again once you get the court out of it, but go beyond that. I mean, really make an effort here. I like to characterize it as take the Patriot Act that's aimed at us and turn it right back around at them and their money, and have that kind of enforcement power aimed at them. So the legislation that we have up on the website, which is a concept draft, does that. It does a lot of different things, and we don't have time to get into it, but it does do that. And the question then you should be left with, well, if we can do that, how are we going to do that, though, with a corrupt Congress? So for that, I look back to the women's suffrage, for example. And this woman, Carrie Chapman Catt, I don't know how many people have heard of her, but she deserves to be much better known than she is. She was the woman who actually strategized the changes in state constitutions and got the 19th Amendment adopted, and was a really good strategist. And this quote from her is a really nice quote that sort of indicates the way, which is, in the language of that day anyway, you just don't care about any other issue till you solve this one. And so that's how the women did it. That's how arguably civil, and remember, women did it with a very small percentage of the vote, with no vote, right, starting out. Exactly, with no vote, had a few male sympathizers, built on that, one in the state here and there, and start to build it up. So they came into it with a very small minority, but they were intent on that one issue, and they won it. Similar with civil rights. Civil rights had, say, 10% of the country was focused on civil rights. And they got it by leaving the party of Lincoln that they had historical ties to. In 1960, Taylor Branch in Parting Waters describes this, and switching in the Kennedy election, and then Johnson sort of gave that the final, he said he institutionalized it and brought African Americans into the Democratic Party. And they got the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act, and ended Jim Crow within 5 years of doing that. So I would say that they use the same strategy. And so I would recommend, as one of many strategies for Occupy to look at, would be this issue of, which works in a first-past-the-post electoral system. If we had proportional representation, that would be different. But in a first-past-the-post system, the two parties, for reasons that I don't have time to explain, tend to converge in the middle and tend to compete for voters in the middle that can switch back and forth between the parties. If you take a vote away from the other party, you're increasing your margin by 2. If you've lost a person who just goes home and won't vote for you because you're too centrist, you lose 1. So the whole tendency is to go for the 2 at the expense of the 1. That's the middle. So we tend to have one-party government with a PR suggesting they're not, but basically you get the same thing whoever's elected, right? So in that system, what is powerful, what's not powerful is third party. That's basically the same as going home. You can go home. If you vote for third party, at least you're telling them why you want home. But it still has the same effect. You're taking 1 vote away from the party that's closest to you, or was closest to you. But single issue voting used by women and civil rights will shift between parties. Now, some people don't like this because they haven't gotten to that point of saying both parties are at fault here and it doesn't really matter. So you have to get by that. But if you can get by that, then what you have is you can do the math. And if you just look at this chart, it's that on single issue voting, you can win with 10 to 20% of the vote. If you want to do primary challenge, well, figure out if the party's half, then you got to get 25% plus 1 to win in a primary against somebody you don't like to get your issues heard. If you start a third party, you'd have to win 33% plus 1. If you're going to try the two-party route, you have to get 50% plus 1. Don't vote. I guess if everybody stayed home, maybe to change something, but don't vote generally just doesn't really have any punch to it. That's basically, Professor Shire at Carleton actually has studied this and has a very interesting philosophy that not voting is what the two parties want you to do. They want to just mobilize those little niche segments that vote for them, that they pay off basically. They don't like the idea of people that haven't paid them voting, because that's too random. Can't control that. You get that? Okay. So a very, very interesting thing that he does, Shire. But in a corrupt two-party system, basically just money. We all know that. Our votes don't matter anyway. It's money that counts. And you don't get anything without the money. So I go back to single issue, which actually has word independent of money, because you're delivering the votes. So just real quickly in the last minute, and now we have to leave, but if you show the last one, I'll show that if you look at the popularity, the people who feel strongly positive about these four different entities, Occupy comes in first, with the number of strongly positives that would be sufficient to execute a single issue voting strategy. Okay. Thanks.